My goodness gracious. Dick Durbin, the senator, the number 2 senator in the Senate right now. He is Schumer's number 2, the whip. His spokesgirl, Jenna Valrestra, has deleted this tweet and locked her account. All I'm saying is I don't think our founding fathers anticipated the survival of this democratic experiment to rest in the hands of a man who lives in a houseboat. For those of you who aren't familiar, Joe Manchin in Washington doesn't have an apartment. He stays in a houseboat. Actually, yes, the founders did intend that. The founders intended that the United States Congress would be part-time. Yeah. How badly have Democrats played this? This is part of the problem that everybody needs to understand. And again, this is objectively so here. This isn't a partisan talking point for me. This isn't trying to be partisan. Y'all really need to understand this, particularly if you're a Democrat, how badly the Democrats have bungled this. Right after the election, Kamala Harris went to Charleston, West Virginia, and did a series of television interviews that Joe Manchin found deeply insulting. She didn't really understand the people of West Virginia. She misstated data about West Virginia, and she appeared to be putting pressure on Joe Manchin to bow to the Democrats' agenda, particularly the Green New Deal, which Joe Manchin is opposed to in part. Remember, Joe Manchin won his race for the United States Senate by literally shooting EPA regulations. Joe Manchin, or was it Obamacare? One of them. No, I think it was the EPA regulations. Joe Manchin shot the climate deal the Democrats had structured with a gun to show how much he hated their Green New Deal efforts. And he got elected, and he has maintained that position. So for Kamala Harris to go to Charleston, West Virginia, and try to bully him into supporting the Democratic agenda did not go over well. And then last week, on a stage, remember, Joe Manchin behind the scenes has been working to actually try to get a deal done on voting rights, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is separate from the For the People Act. He's actually behind the scenes been working, trying to get a deal done. He's actually behind the scenes been working on environmental regulations. He's actually behind the scenes been working on the infrastructure deal. And last week on a stage in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Joe Biden attacked Joe Manchin. Didn't use his name, but everybody knew he was talking about Joe Manchin, who he said sides more with Republicans than with him. Also, Kristen Sinema attacked her. When you keep attacking Joe Manchin as a Democrat publicly, he's not going to want to work with you. The Republicans are saying nice things about Manchin. The Democrats are not. And by the way, if Joe Manchin were to flip and become a Republican, suddenly Mitch McConnell is back in charge of the Senate. Do they want that? Do you, as a Democrat, want Mitch McConnell back in charge of the Senate? If Joe Manchin flips to the GOP, that's what you get. That's what you get. The Democrats are bungling their handling of Joe Manchin. The care and feeding of your own is like politics 101, and they're screwing it up. And that has now left them with their agenda sabotaged by one of their own because they couldn't tread lightly and work behind the scenes with Manchin, even though he's been pinning op-eds saying he wants to work behind the scenes to get stuff done, including a voting rights bill. They've screwed up their own agenda. It's like they don't know how to run the Senate because they haven't in so long. Joe Biden bears part of the responsibility here as well. They've sabotaged themselves now. They've sabotaged themselves. Joe Biden's agenda is screwed up. And guess what's next? Infrastructure. It's going to get screwed up as well, thanks to their bungling and handling of Joe Manchin. They just can't leave anything unscrewed up. All right. I'm this. I wasn't even going to go here. This is ridiculousness. All right, hang on. I need to. Who is this? Who is this person? Oh, what? Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh, oh. There you go. Oh, wow. So Sarah Kelly, this explains everything. Sarah Kelly is a sports editor, now a copy editor for Sports Illustrated, had been the sports editor at the Washington Post. She was also a copy editor at SB Nation. She's got a journalism degree from the University of Kansas and Arizona State University. She started out there, transferred to the University of Kansas. My goodness, listen, I don't say this lightly because let me just acknowledge some reality here. I could stand to use a few pounds. I could. I'm just being honest here, and I'm not nearly as diligent as my wife. So my wife does meal prep and she weighs everything out. She uses a scale, and it sucks the joy out of eating, and I love to eat. That's my problem. Beer and pizza diet isn't necessarily good for you. I have been going to CrossFit. I do go 3 times a week, and I'm putting on more muscle, and I still need to lose weight. But I digress. I say this as a fat person. Sarah Kelly is the copy editor for Sports Illustrated, and she has tweeted this. Anti-fatness is a perpetuation and enforcement of white supremacy beauty standards. It's not harmless and didn't develop in a vacuum. Thanks to my buddy Fred on Twitter for sending this link my way. Anti-fatness is a perpetuation and enforcement of white supremacy beauty standards. It's not harmless and didn't develop in a vacuum. You know what? The reason I'm trying to get myself in better shape and lose weight is because the larger you are, the more health problems you have. Fatness is not good for you. And those of us who like to eat have to be more diligent and eat more fruits and vegetables. And man, do I hate fruit. Y'all, I don't like fruit. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't like fruit. I am a picky eater. I will eat an apple, but it must be a raw apple. I will not eat bananas. I have nothing against bananas, but my grandfather, when I was little, was toothless, and all he could eat were mushy bananas, and it grossed me out. Mushy bananas, soggy cornflakes, and Campbell's vegetable soup. That was his entire diet, and I can't eat any of those things at this point in my life, although I will use cornflakes and other ingredients. But I know, it just grosses me out. But that's it. I mean, fruit for me is an apple. And an apple a day keeps the doctor away, and I got to be more diligent about eating apples every day. But fatness is not something anyone should be proud of, and I'm not. I know I've been losing weight. You know, the worst thing about weight loss, honestly, because I have been losing weight, is I got to buy a new wardrobe, and it sucks. And I mean, it's good, but it's also expensive. It's expensive. But the idea that urging people to not be fat is an enforcement of white supremacy beauty standards that is some next level BS. And you keep in mind that this person is an editor for Sports Illustrated, which tells you everything about the sports. Are there any women sports commentators out there who aren't woke? You know, it's like the idiot woman at USA Today who is lamenting college football coming back. She's a college football analyst and columnist for USA Today who was lamenting essentially that she was going to have to work for a living. I don't understand these people. I just don't. And again, this comes full circle to wokeness and this bubble that the left is in. Genuinely, it's truly bizarre. The level of bubble that the Democrats are in, where they think this stuff is good. Like, for example, defund the police. Democratic alarm bells are going off. Let me tell you what happened in Texas. I always say in local elections and special elections, we should never make more of them than they are, but we should also not underplay them. And there's a tendency, if a special election goes your way, you make it into be the grand and glorious thing, and special elections really aren't typical elections. And if they go against you, you tend to overly dismiss it when there are some fundamental issues. Republicans swept some major races in Texas. One of them is McAllen, Texas. McAllen, Texas is on the border with Mexico. It is 150,000 people. It is 85% Hispanic, and Republicans have elected the mayor there, the first time since 1997. Now, don't make more of it than it is. It was only a couple of hundred votes and only about a 5 to 7% turnout. That is fair. You need to know that. Now, Republicans also elected Jim Ross as mayor of Arlington, Texas, which is a suburb of 400,000 people, and is only 39% white. And Fort Worth is the 12th largest city in the country. It's got more than 1 million people. Only about a third of them are white, and they've elected a Republican in all three of these places. The Democrats are having problems. The Democrats are having all sorts of problems now connecting with Hispanic voters in Texas. And remember, the theory had been that as Texas became more Hispanic, it would become more Democrat. In fact, Republicans are now picking up mayoral seats in Texas in deeply Hispanic communities in ways the prevailing wisdom on the Democratic side said they would not. If you've listened to me, I don't consider myself some sort of grand and glorious prophet on these things. But if you've listened to me for a while, I've said a couple of things that you need to pay attention to. Immigration, particularly Latino Hispanic immigration into the United States, actually is not good for the Democrats. Now, I know Republicans, for a number of reasons, have internalized immigration bad. I understand that. I do. And there are a lot of reasons that aren't nativist, racist reasons for the Republicans to say so, and we shouldn't mischaracterize the Republicans of saying that. But one thing a lot of Republicans don't understand, and a lot of Democrats don't understand, but a reason I, for example, have a friend of mine who is a very prominent Democratic, all of you would know him, and he's actually opposed to immigration for political reasons. He's opposed to increased Hispanic immigration for political reasons. The longer Hispanic voters stay in this country, the more likely they are to become white Republican, particularly if they are Protestant. Pentecostalism has taken hold in South America and parts of Central America. The Assemblies of God, the Pentecostals and others, the charismatic faiths of Protestantism, they've taken hold in Central and South America. In fact, in Brazil, which is of Portuguese, not Spanish descent, but in Brazil, a Brazilian is more likely to attend a charismatic Protestant denomination these days than a Catholic denomination. And those Protestant charismatic Hispanics are moving to the United States, and they're becoming Republican because their faith defines them, and Democrats tell them they can't be white, and they begin to identify as white voters. Remember what was it, Trayvon Martin? What was the name of the guy who shot him? I can't remember, but he was identified as a white Hispanic, and everybody's like, what the heck is a white Hispanic? You're either Hispanic or not. Well, the Democrats have categorized people now as being black Hispanic or white Hispanic, and the shooter in that case was classified as a white Hispanic. Therefore, he was a white guy. When the Democrats keep dividing people up by these things, guess what? In this country, whether you like it or not, the perception of white people is that the police are more tolerant of them, that they get better jobs, that they make more money, that they have more stable marriages, that they get access to education. I mean, this is what the Democrats tell people. Whether it's true or not, it's what Democrats tell people. And the result is that a Hispanic person says, you know what, I'm going to do what white people do. And what do white people do according to Democrats? They vote Republican. When you start defining people by their race and giving stereotypes for races, guess what happens? Some people say, hey, if race is a social construct, I'm going to socially construct myself as a white person. I mean, this is the logical fallout of the Democrats' policies. And in Texas, Hispanic voters look at Republicans, and do you know what they see? Winners. And so guess what Hispanic voters are doing? They're voting Republican. Why? Because they want to win. As an aside, I know multiple people who live along the border in Texas, and they tell me racism is a real issue, and it is a racism between black and Hispanic people along the border, and it's something not commonly talked about inside the media bubbles. The media bubble is white people versus everyone else. In South Texas, it is black versus Hispanic people, and Hispanic people more and more as a result identify as white people, given what they perceive as racism from the black community of people who are longtime American citizens, black people who are longtime American citizens reacting to immigrants into this country from Mexico and South, and those people then tend to vote with the white people who tend to vote Republican as a result. We're seeing all of this happen. When the Democrats have decided to do all this identity politics nonsense and tell everyone that you can't be a racist unless you're a white person and be dismissive of racism within the Hispanic community directed towards the Hispanic community, those people go Republican, and we're seeing this across the board. Democrats have forever said Republicans were going to wind up like the California Republican Party. It turns out that the Texas and Florida Republican Party may actually be the better template, and that means it's bad news for the Democrats across the board. Democrats are only just now coming to terms with that fact. They probably are way too far behind to get over their identity politics. It's going to hurt them, and this data out of Texas shows it. It's not just Democrats themselves have gone overboard in a deep analysis, a 76-page analysis. The New York Times has this story out now about the analysis the Democratic Party itself has conducted. Democrats defeated President Trump and captured the Senate last year with a racially diverse coalition that delivered victories by tiny margins in Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. In the next election, they cannot count on repeating that feat, a new report warns. Wait until you hear what else this report tells the Democrats. It's not good for them. Live by identity politics, die by identity politics.
News and in-depth analysis.
Hello there. It is Erick Erickson here. The phone number is 877-97-ERIC, 877-973-7425. Well, the Democrats they've released their postmortem. I mentioned it before we went into the break. I have dived into this, but let me just give you the synopsis from Chris Cillizza, who, this guy, he is like the paragon of conventional wisdom that's wrong in Washington, D.C. But he got the bottom line right here. The headline from his piece at CNN, the most dangerous word for Democrats in 2022. A Democrat postmortem of the 2020 election reveals the troubling reality. Many voters were convinced by Republican attacks that the Democratic Party and its candidates embraced socialism and other radical views. Campaign public discourse in paid media, earned media, and direct voter contact and message and opinion research indicated that voters recalled attacks related to radical socialists, defund the police, and related messages, read a section of the report, which was conducted by a series of Democratic advocacy groups, including Third Way and the Latino Victory Project, first obtained by the New York Times. Well, let's go to the New York Times. The 73-page report was done at the behest of three major Democratic interest groups: Third Way, a centrist group, Collective PAC, and Latino Victory Fund, which promotes Black and Hispanic candidates. It appears to be the most thorough act of self-criticism carried out by the Democrats. The document is all the more striking because it is addressed to a victorious party. Despite their successes, Democrats had hoped to achieve more robust control of both chambers of Congress, rather than the ultra-precarious margins they enjoy. In part, the study found, Democrats fell short of their aspirations because many House and Senate candidates failed to match Joe Biden's support with voters of color who loathed Donald Trump but distrusted the Democratic Party as a whole. Those constituencies included Hispanic voters in Florida and Texas, Vietnamese Americans and Filipino American voters in California, and Black voters in North Carolina. Overall, the report warns, Democrats in 2020 lacked a core argument about the economy and recovering from the coronavirus pandemic, one that might have helped candidates repel Republican claims that they wanted to keep the economy shut down or worse. The party leaned too heavily on anti-Trump rhetoric. What? How can you be too anti-Trump? Remember, this is to some degree at odds with James Carville's advice. James Carville advised Democrats they need to continue to tie the GOP and Donald Trump to January 6th. It's not actually working. The other thing is that the media, remember the fiery but mostly peaceful protest? That was the cry on the text on the TV screen at CNN. The American voters realized otherwise. The American voters realized that the Democrats were moving to the left. But here's the problem, and I need you to understand this. And if you're listening to me and you are where I am or to the right of me, you will get this intuitively. But if you're a Democratic person, and I know progressives hate listen to this program because I get the angry, nasty emails from them all the time. But you need to understand that reporters and progressives look at themselves inside their bubble and think that they are the mainstream. And they look at everyone to the right of them and think they are far outside the mainstream. And actually, it's exactly the opposite. So reporters defended Democrats' defund the police rhetoric and actually defended socialism. You had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez out there defending socialism, saying what a good thing socialism is. And it turns out it didn't actually work for the Democrats. It didn't work. Their policies failed them, and their policies are going to continue to fail them because of the way they talk about capitalism and other things.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Capitalism has not always existed in the world. It will not always exist in the world. When this country started, we were not a capitalist nation.
That was Deep Thoughts by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
When you've got people like that out there as your spokesgal, it doesn't help you. The Democrats, and here's what's so funny here is I can hear the Democrats yelling, "We won! We won everything! We won we got Congress!" Yes, barely. On all fronts, Donald Trump lost 43,000 votes. Would have won the Electoral College. The Republicans almost got back the House. They only lost the Senate because Georgia Republicans sabotaged themselves. But then they made gains at the state level, and they'll redistrict, and they'll take back Congress next year. And you've got moderate Democratic groups now raving red flags, warning. And progressive Democrats are saying, don't listen to those guys. Don't listen to those guys. If the Democrats don't listen to them, good. I hope they don't listen to them. It'll be better for the GOP. When we come back, Donald Trump got out on stage in North Carolina.
15.
And immediately members of the media began smearing him with something that's already been fact-checked as not true, and the press doesn't care. Hello and welcome. It is Erick Erickson here, the second hour. Glad to have you with me. The phone number is 877-97-ERIC, 877-973-7425. Absolutely delighted to have you with me. I gotta follow up on a point I made in the last hour. I've gotten questions from listeners. Now, if you're just tuning in, let me set the stage for you. I want to get to the President Trump, but before I get there, Democrats, an outside group, have launched a detailed 76-page report on why the Democrats have to be careful headed into 2022 and why the November election didn't go as well for them as they thought. Now, keep in mind there is a talking point out there that everything went hunky-dory for the Democrats in November, except it didn't. They were really expecting a Democratic wave, and it didn't happen. In fact, the Republicans had a counter wave. And with the exception of Donald Trump, Republicans did very, very well. Not a single incumbent Republican in the House lost. In fact, they held all of their seats, including that wave of retirements of Republicans who thought they were going to lose. And also a lot of Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans voted Republican. But so I got a lot of questions during the break from people who were dwelling on something in the report. Let me read for you. I got to pull back up the report because I closed it out. Yep, here we go. One of the things that was in the report said that constituencies including Hispanic voters in Florida and Texas, Vietnamese Americans and Filipino American voters in California, and black voters in North Carolina didn't trust the Democratic Party. What's going on there? Let me explain this one to you in some very general terms. One of the reasons the Democrats have a real problem with identity politics where they're headed is because I don't know a Latino or Hispanic, whichever you prefer, voter who views themselves as a Latino or Hispanic voter. They are Mexican, Peruvian, Colombian, Guatemalan, Honduran, Argentinian, Brazilian, Dominican, Haitian, Puerto Rican, Cuban. They are distinct nationalities from distinct nation states. And the Democrats have woven them all into this Latino or Hispanic category, where they then go further and classify them as black Hispanic or white Hispanic or black Latino or white Latino. Meanwhile, these people are thinking, actually, we're from Peru, or actually, we're from Cuba, or actually, we're from Puerto Rico. And their issues are different. But the same goes doubly true for Asian American voters who are Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indian subcontinent, Indonesian, Thai. They're not Asian voters. They are voters of distinct nationalities. And as someone who grew up in the Middle East, who spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, I assure you there is a great difference between a Malaysian and a Thai, and an Indonesian, and Vietnamese, and Laotian, and Chinese, and Japanese. You may not be able to distinguish. They do. And let's just break down Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino. Now, Korean American voters have tended to vote Republican. Do you know why? Random trivia here. Korea is predominantly Christian. The largest Presbyterian churches on planet Earth are in Korea. A Presbyterian missionary, and now I forget his name, and someone will send it to me again, and I always forget his name. In the 1800s, Korea shut down. No foreigners allowed. And a vessel sailed up the river to Pyongyang, which was the capital at the time. This is well before the division between North and South Korea. And a Presbyterian missionary with a Bible written in Korean was on board. They decided they were gonna force the Koreans to trade. The Koreans were having none of it. The boat ran aground, and the Koreans tried to kill them all. You were a foreigner. You weren't allowed in the country. Eventually, they were able to set fire to the ship, and everyone jumped ship. They were all slaughtered, including the missionary, who was the only one not fighting back. He was trying to hand books to people, Bibles in Korean, and those Koreans, he was killed, but they took it home and started reading, and thus began the conversion of the Korean Peninsula. And they are massively Presbyterian. The largest Presbyterian churches, again, on the planet are Korean. When you find Korean churches in America, they tend to be inside PCA and PCUSA churches. The Korean American Christian population overwhelmingly already votes Republican. The Filipino American population tends to be either Catholic or Pentecostal. Much like South American Hispanic voters, if they are from charismatic denominations, they tend to vote Republican. And in fact, Catholic Filipino voters tend to rapidly be voting Republican. And remember, the Philippines used to be an American territory. It's not like they don't have ties to the United States. They were an American territory up until World War II and shortly thereafter. The Filipinos have the closest ties to the United States, and the longer someone has ties to the U.S., the more they tend to vote Republican. The Vietnamese Americans rapidly shifted to the Republican Party over the last few years as the Democratic Party has moved more to the left, because Vietnamese Americans are what? Refugees from what? Communism. As the Democratic Party has embraced Bernie Sanders, an apologist for the Soviet Union, and people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who defend socialism, Vietnamese Americans have moved to the right. Indian American voters have moved to the right for the same reasons, socialism, and also Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley. The first two statewide Indian American elected officials happen to be Republican. Indian Americans, therefore, have translated that into, you want to be successful in politics? Go GOP. Indian American voters, that is not American Indian, but Indian subcontinent voters, have moved towards the GOP. Chinese and Japanese immigrants who tend to not be a Christian and tend to be more about money and society and cultural lifestyle, they have tended for some time, and that's not to stereotype them, and I don't mean it pejoratively, but they have tended to have greater ties to the Democratic Party, where in cultural elite institutions, Democrats are dominant. Japanese and Chinese Americans wanting access to culturally elite institutions have tended to be Democrat. People mirror those native U.S. peoples who I hate to say Native Americans, but you know what I mean, where they want to be successful. So if you're a Chinese immigrant from a Christian family, you tend to vote Republican. If you're a Chinese immigrant who is secular, you tend to go with secularists, and they tend to be Democrat. Same with the Japanese. But the bottom line is that they're Japanese, and they're Chinese, and they're Vietnamese, and they're Filipino, and they're Korean, and they're Laotian, and they're Malaysian, and they're Thai, and they're Indonesian, and they're Indian, and they're Sri Lankan. They're not Asian Americans. And as the Democratic Party continues to cluster all of these people into a racial category that is made up and does not exist, it alienates those voters. And the Democrats are not really even able to articulate it because they have become so invested in identity politics and critical theory. They can't understand it. If you'll recall, remember we had this score of so-called Asian American hate. Or, by the way, Asian American and Pacific Islander. Do you know that's not a thing? Do you know how it's a thing? It is a thing in that the U.S. government, the Commerce Department, had to come up with a category. And they wanted to wrap in all of the people from Pacific Islands and the various Asian countries. Asia happens to be a ginormous continent. There are lots of countries, but they needed a catch-all for the census. And so their catch-all was Asian, American, and Pacific Islander. It's a category made up by the federal government. It's not a real thing. No one out there except the political left-wing activists say, I'm an Asian American Pacific Islander. Really? Where are you from? Decatur, Georgia. Okay, sure. Only the Democrats do this. And as a result, they're losing their ability to relate to people who view themselves as immigrants from things called countries, not things. Yeah, who immigrates from a race? Well, I am an Asian and I'm going to immigrate to America and be an Asian American. No, you don't immigrate from Asia. You immigrate from one of these countries. You don't immigrate from Latin. Well, I mean, where the hell is Latin? I guess Latin America. I'm going to immigrate from Latin America. No one who's actually fleeing Latin America says, I'm leaving Latin America and I'm going to be a Latino voter. No, you don't do that. It's like saying that I'm a, well, and you know, by the way, this actually gets to me. So my dad is Swedish. My dad, believe it or not, my real name is Erick Erickson. You'd be amazed at the people in radio who make up their names. I actually am Erick Erickson. I am, according to my father's family, the 16th Erick Erickson. According to my cousin Gunnar, yes, who is also, my son is named Gunnar, Gunnar because it's Swedish, not Gunner because it's Southern. Gunnar because he's Swedish. My cousin Gunnar, when I went over and visited years ago, told me that I was the 16th in an unbroken chain. I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's what he told me, so I'm going with it. My dad is Erick Erickson. His 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 dad is Erick Erickson. All the way back. By the way, if you're Swedish and you keep with the traditional thing, it's Doder if you're daughter. So Eric Doder would be my grandfather or my dad's daughter if we kept traditional naming sequence, which makes genealogy really, really hard, by the way. But nonetheless, I digress. The Democrats now refer to white people as European Americans. Yeah, the silence is there to allow you to ponder. This is where the identity politics is going for the Democrats. You're no longer white, you're a European American, Latino American, Hispanic American, Asian American, African American, European American. That's the new thing. We're going to be continentally identified. My dad's family's Swedish. They don't identify themselves as European Americans. They're Swedish Americans. In fact, they don't identify as Swedish. In this country, they identify as American. They are Americans. Only the Democrats want to divide people up that way. And it's not going to keep working for them. They're losing the Vietnamese. They're losing the Filipino Americans. They're losing the Indian subcontinent Americans. They're losing the South American Americans. Now, this is very interesting. If you are in the Central America, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, you tend to El Salvador, you tend to lean Democrat. If you're from South America, you tend now to lean Republican. Why is that? Because many of the South American immigrants to this country are fleeing socialist regimes. They're fleeing the socialist rise in South America. In Peru, there's been a very, very close election in Peru. It is right now too close to call between a conservative and a progressive. And right now, the leftist Castillo has overtaken by an extremely tiny, slim lead the conservative Kiko Fujimori. There's a big Japanese immigrant population that has in Peru. And they don't identify, by the way, as Japanese Peruvian. They identify as Peruvian. People come to the United States not because they want to be still a Venezuelan American or a Cuban American or a Latino American or Hispanic American. They come to this country because they want to be American. And the Republicans have finally figured this out. You know, Republicans, when they talk to a Hispanic farmer, they talk to a farmer. They may speak in Spanish, but they talk to a farmer who's an American. When you talk to the Latino mom, you're not talking to a Latino mom, you're talking to an American mom. And you may speak in Spanish, but you're speaking to them as a mom. In Florida, that's what the Republicans did and did so well. They didn't talk to people who were Puerto Ricans about Puerto Rican issues. They talked to them about crime, law, and order issues. And they did it in Spanish. There had been this reluctance for a very long time for Republicans to actually speak in Spanish to Spanish language voters. But they've started doing that. And guess what? It works quite well. These people want to be American. They don't want to be hung on a racial identity that isn't really an accurate identity. They want to be Americans. They want the American dream. And the Democrats are now telling them you can't get the American dream because of whitey. So guess what these people are doing? They're identifying as white. and they're being attacked by Democrats for doing it. Maybe we should stop identifying people by the color of their skin and actually embrace Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision, who said what? We should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. I cannot believe it's the Democratic Party that's abandoned that, and yet they have. It is giving the Republicans an advantage.
I really do like